Why did you kill your mother? The police officer asked, his voice sharp, probing. He stared at Chijioke with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. I killed her because I had no choice, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. And you won't believe me either if I tell you the truth. Adaobi Nwokolo sat in her plush living room, her manicured fingers nervously drumming on the glass coffee table. The chandelier above her cast a warm glow on the luxurious furniture, but nothing about the room felt inviting. Her gaze was fixed on Daniel, the man she had been in a relationship with for 3 years. Daniel stood by the window, his back to her. His tall, muscular frame cut an imposing figure, but Adaobi was no longer charmed by it. She could feel her frustration bubbling to the surface. I've told you already, she said, her voice sharp with irritation. I'm not giving you 10 million naira, Daniel. You've asked for enough. Daniel turned around, his face a mask of annoyance. It's just 10 million, Adaobi. To you, that's pocket change. You're sitting on billions. Why are you being stingy all of a sudden? Adaobi clenched her fists, trying to control her anger. This isn't about being stingy. It's about principle. I've helped you countless times. I paid off your debts. I funded your failed business ventures. I even bought you a car. When does it stop, Daniel? When do you start standing on your own 2 feet? Daniel scoffed, crossing his arms. So now you're throwing all that in my face? I thought you loved me. Love doesn't mean being taken advantage of. Adaobi snapped, rising from her seat. Her voice echoed through the room. I've given you everything, and all you do is take. You don't even pretend to care about me anymore. It's always about money. Daniel's expression darkened. Don't act like you're some saint, Adaobi. You're nothing without your money. Do you think men like me would even look at you if you weren't rich? You're just an aging woman who's desperate for attention. The words hit her like a slap. Adaobi felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and hurt. She took a step back, her voice trembling. Get out. What? Daniel asked, startled. You hurt me, she said, her tone cold and final. Get out of my house, I'm done with you. Daniel stared at her, his face a mix of disbelief and fury. You'll regret this, Adaobi. No one else will put up with you. Maybe, she said, holding her ground. But I'd rather be alone than be used. Without another word, Daniel stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving Adaobi alone in the deafening silence. That night, Adaobi lay in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. Daniel's cruel words replayed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. An aging woman, desperate for attention. No one else will put up with you. She turned onto her side, hugging a pillow as tears streamed down her face. She wasn't desperate. She was just lonely. All she had ever wanted was to love and be loved in return. But every man she had let into her life had only seen her as a walking bank account. The realization was suffocating. At 39 years old, she was no closer to having the family she had dreamed of. Her friends were married with children, their lives full of laughter and chaos. Meanwhile, she was alone in a mansion that felt more like a gilded cage with each passing day. At 3 a.m., unable to bear the silence any longer, Adaobi picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Amaka. The phone rang twice before Amaka's groggy voice came through. Adaobi, it's the middle of the night, what's wrong? I'm sorry for waking you, Adaobi said, her voice shaky. I needed someone to talk to. Amaka's tone softened immediately. What happened? Adaobi hesitated, then poured out everything: her fight with Daniel, his cruel words, her fears about being alone forever. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse, and fresh tears were streaming down her face. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Amaka spoke. Adaobi, you need to stop letting these men define your worth. You're a strong, successful woman. You don't need a man to complete you. But I want a family, Amaka, Adaobi whispered. I want someone to love, someone who will love me back. I'm almost 40. What if it's too late? It's not too late, Amaka said firmly. But maybe it's time to think outside the box. Who says you need a man to have a family? Adaobi frowned. What do you mean? I mean adoption, Amaka said. You've always wanted to be a mother, right? Why wait for a man to give you a biological child when you could give a child who needs love a home? Think about it, Adaobi. You have the resources, the time, the love to give. Why not adopt? The idea hit Adobi like a bolt of lightning. She had never seriously considered adoption before, but now, in the quiet of the night, it felt like a lifeline. Adopt, she murmured, the word tasting unfamiliar on her tongue. Yes, Amaka said. You'll be an amazing mother, Adobi, and you won't have to depend on anyone else to give you the family you deserve. For the first time that night, Adobi felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Amaka, she said, her voice steadier now. You always know what to say. What are friends for? Amaka replied with a yawn. Now go to bed. We'll talk more in the morning. The next morning, Adobi woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She spent hours researching adoption agencies, reading success stories, and learning about the process. The more she read, the more the idea resonated with her. She imagined herself holding a child's hand, tucking them into bed, watching them grow and thrive under her care. For the first time in years, she felt like she had found a path forward, a way to fill the void in her heart without compromising her self-worth. Later that week, Adobi made her first call to an adoption agency. As she spoke with the coordinator, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. It wouldn't be easy, she knew. Raising a child on her own would come with challenges, but Adobi was ready to face them. She had spent too many years giving her love to the wrong people. Now she was ready to give it to someone who truly needed it, someone who would love her for who she was, not for what she could give. As she hung up the phone, Adobi looked out the window of her office. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It felt like the beginning of something new, something beautiful. For the first time in a long time, Adobi felt at peace. She was ready to become a mother. The day Adobi brought Chijioke home was one she would never forget. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, transforming one of the spare rooms in her mansion into a vibrant, child-friendly space. The walls were painted a soft blue, adorned with decals of animals and stars, and the shelves were lined with toys and books. At just 4 years old, Chijioke was breathtakingly handsome, with big, curious eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. His tiny frame was fragile but full of potential, and his shy smile melted Adobi's heart. She held his small hand as they walked through the front door of her home. "Welcome home, Chijioke," she said softly. The boy looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. "This is my house?" he asked in a timid voice. "Our house," Adobi corrected, kneeling to his level. "This is where we'll live together. You'll never be alone again." Chijioke nodded, clutching her hand tighter. Though he didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, he could feel the warmth in her words. For the first time in his young life, he felt safe. Adobi threw herself into motherhood with zeal. She woke early to prepare his meals, personally drove him to and from school, and spent her evenings helping him with homework or playing games. Birthdays were extravagant celebrations, with cakes as tall as Chijioke and gifts that left him speechless. "Anything my son wants, he gets," Adobi often said with pride. Years passed, and Chijioke grew into a bright and confident boy. By the time he was 12, he was taller and stronger, his once fragile frame filling out with muscle. He excelled in school, earning praise from his teachers and admiration from his peers. But it wasn't just his academic success that made Adobi proud, it was his kind heart and the way he treated others. Every evening, Adobi and Chijioke would sit together at the dinner table, sharing stories about their day. Their bond was unbreakable, or so Adobi thought. But as Chijioke approached his teenage years, his questions began to shift from innocent curiosities to deeper inquiries about their life. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching television, Chijioke turned to her with a serious expression. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, my love," Adobi said, lowering the volume on the television. "Who is my father?" he asked, his voice hesitant but firm. The question hit Adobi like a thunderbolt. She had always known this day would come, but had never fully prepared herself for it. Her smile faltered for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He was a wonderful man, kind, loving, and brave. What happened to him?" Chijioke asked, his eyes searching hers for answers. Adobi's throat tightened. He died in a car accident when you were very young. It was just the two of us after that." She placed a hand on her chest and let out a heavy sigh. He loved you so much, Chijioke. Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever been through. Her voice broke, and she began to sob, burying her face in her hands. Chijioke immediately moved closer, wrapping his arms around her. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to make you sad. No, my darling, Adobi said, wiping her tears and pulling him into a tight embrace. It's just, I've tried so hard to give you everything, to make sure you never feel the pain I felt. The boy nodded, guilt written all over his face. I love you, Mom. I'm glad I have you. And I love you more than anything, Adobi whispered, holding him close. From that moment on, Chijioke stopped asking questions about his father. Adobi had succeeded in silencing his curiosity, but deep down, the guilt of her lie weighed heavily on her. She justified it to herself, believing it was better for Chijioke to think he had lost a father than to know he had been adopted. But cracks in the facade began to form as the years went by. Chijioke, now entering adolescence, began noticing the subtle differences between himself and Adobi. People often commented on how different they looked, and though Adobi always brushed it off with a laugh, the comments lingered in Chijioke's mind. One evening, he stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom studying his reflection. His deep brown skin, angular face, and athletic build seemed so different from Adobi's lighter complexion and softer features. Why don't I look like her? He whispered to himself. Still, he pushed the thought aside. To him, Adobi was his mother, the only parent he had ever known. She had given him a life most children could only dream of, and he didn't want to hurt her by questioning her further. But for Adaobi, the weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day. Every time she looked into Chijioke's eyes, she was reminded of the truth she was hiding. She told herself she was protecting him, sparing him from the pain of knowing he had been abandoned, but deep down she feared what would happen if he ever found out. Would he still love her? Or would he see her as a liar, someone who had betrayed his trust? For now, Adobi clung to the fragile peace they shared, hoping against hope that the truth would remain buried. But she knew deep down that the day of reckoning was inevitable. The tension in the house was palpable. It had started as a simple argument, like so many others recently. Chijioke had been chatting with a girl from school, a classmate he seemed to like. Adobi, however, was livid when she overheard him talking about her on the phone. Who is this girl, Chijioke? What kind of nonsense is this? Adobi's voice rose as she paced the living room, her arms crossed tightly. Mom, she's just a friend, Chijioke replied, exasperated. Why do you always overreact? I can't even talk to someone without you questioning me like this. Adobi's eyes narrowed. Overreact? Chijioke, I've warned you about these girls. They don't care about you. They only want to use you. You're too young to understand this. I'm not a child anymore, Mom, Chijioke shouted, his voice echoing through the large room. You act like you own me. Why do you treat me like I owe you my life? The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Adobi froze, her expression shifting from anger to something deeper, something Chijioke couldn't quite place. Chijioke. Her voice softened as she sat down, her hands trembling slightly. You're right. You don't owe me anything. But there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Chijioke frowned, his frustration giving way to confusion. What are you talking about? Adobi hesitated, looking away as though searching for the courage to continue. Finally, she met his gaze, tears welling in her eyes. You're not my biological son, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to fall silent, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. What? Chijioke's voice cracked as he stared at her in disbelief. I adopted you, Adobi continued, tears now streaming down her face. You were 4 years old. I told you your father died in a car accident because I didn't want you to feel unwanted. I wanted to protect you. Chijioke took a step back, shaking his head. Number? No, that's not true. Why would you lie about something like that? I didn't know how else to explain it, Adobi said, her voice breaking. I was lonely, Chijioke. I wanted a child so badly, and when I saw you at the orphanage, I knew you were meant to be mine. But I didn't think you'd understand if I told you the truth. I thought it wouldn't matter because I loved you like my own. Chioke's hands balled into fists at his sides. So all this time, everything you told me about my father, about our life, it was all a lie? I never meant to hurt you, Adeobi pleaded. You have to believe me. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. But what about me, Mom? Chijioke spat, the word mom feeling foreign on his tongue now. Did you ever think about what this would do to me? My whole life. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew you. And now I don't know anything. Adeobi stood and reached for him, but he took another step back. Don't, he said, his voice trembling. Don't try to make this okay. You lied to me. You made me believe a story that wasn't even real. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? Chioke, please, Adobi begged. I love you. You are my son. No matter what. Nothing changes that. Everything changes that, Chijioke shouted, his voice raw with emotion. Do you even understand what you've done? You've made me question everything about my life. My father, my identity, my childhood. It's all a lie. Adeobi fell silent, her sobs the only sound in the room. Chijioke turned away, pacing as he tried to process the weight of what he'd just learned. His chest felt heavy, his mind a whirlwind of emotion sang her. Betrayal, sadness, and confusion all fighting for dominance. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped and faced her. Why now? He asked, his voice quieter but no less strained. Why are you telling me this now? Adeobi wiped her tears, her hands trembling. Because I couldn't keep lying to you. You deserve to know the truth. I didn't know how to tell you. Chijioke shook his head. You should have told me a long time ago. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Adobi alone with her guilt and regret. In his room, Chijioke sat on his bed, staring at the floor. The woman he had loved and trusted all his life, the woman he had called Mom, was now a stranger. He felt like the ground beneath him had crumbled, leaving him unmoored and unsure of who he was anymore. A disturbing turn. The days following Adobi's revelation were strained. Chijioke barely spoke to her, retreating to his room after school and avoiding her gaze during dinner. Adobi, however, seemed determined to close the growing distance between them, but her actions became unsettling. It started subtly. She would sit closer to him on the couch, brushing his arm unnecessarily when handing him the television remote. At first, Chijioke dismissed it, thinking she was simply trying to reconnect after the argument. But as the days went on, her behavior became harder to ignore. You're growing into such a handsome young man, she said one evening, her hand lingering on his shoulder. Chioke shifted uncomfortably. Thanks, I guess, he muttered, moving away slightly. But Adobi's comments didn't stop. She began complimenting his physique, touching his arm when commenting on his strength, and giving him long, almost longing stares. Chijioke tried to brush it off, convincing himself he was reading too much into it. After all, this was his mother adopted or not. But one night, her behavior escalated. Chijioke had just come out of the shower, a towel draped over his shoulders, when he entered the living room to grab his phone. Adobi was sitting there, waiting for him. You didn't say goodnight, she said, her tone light but her eyes intense. I was about to, Chijioke replied cautiously, keeping his distance. Adobi stood and walked toward him, her silk robe loosely tied. You've been avoiding me, Chijioke. I don't like it when you're distant. I'm not avoiding you, Mom, he said, the word Mom feeling increasingly difficult to say. I'm just processing everything. She moved closer, reaching out to place a hand on his chest. You don't have to call me Mom, you know. It's just the two of us here. No one else matters. Chioke froze, his breath catching. What are you doing? Her hand lingered, her fingers tracing the edge of the towel on his shoulder. You're not a little boy anymore, Chijioke. You're a man now. You don't need to be afraid of deeper connections. His stomach churned. Shocked and disgusted, he stepped back, his voice rising. What the hell is wrong with you? I'm your son. Adobi's calm demeanor shattered, and she laughed bitterly. You're not my son, Chijioke. You've never been my son. I adopted you because I was lonely, because I wanted someone who would always be mine, someone who would never leave me. Chijioke stared at her, horrified. What are you saying? I'm saying, she said, her voice trembling with desperation, that my love for you has always been more than just a mother's love. I've cared for you, given you everything. Why can't you see that? You're sick. Chijioke spat, backing away. You need help. Don't say that, Adobi begged, tears streaming down her face. I love you, Chijioke. I need you. Please don't push me away. But Chijioke couldn't bear to look at her. Without another word, he turned and fled to his room, locking the door behind him. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what had just happened. The woman he once called his mother had become a stranger, someone he no longer recognized, and for the first time in his life, he truly felt unsafe in his own home. Chijioke tried to create as much distance as possible between himself and Adobi. He avoided her at every opportunity, spending long hours at school hanging out with friends and locking himself in his room whenever he was home. But Adobi's obsession only grew stronger with his avoidance. She began leaving notes on his desk, slipping them under his door when he refused to answer her calls. The notes were filled with confessions of love and pleas for him to forgive her. She even left small gifts, a watch, cologne, and other things she thought might win him back. But to Chijioke, these gestures only deepened his sense of disgust and unease. One evening, as he was coming back from the kitchen with a glass of water, Adobi appeared in the hallway. She had been waiting for him. Chioke, we need to talk, she said softly, blocking his path. There's nothing to talk about, he replied coldly, trying to step around her. But she grabbed his arm, her grip firm. Please, stop running from me. I can't stand this anymore. He pulled his arm away. You need to let this go, Adaobi. Whatever you think is between us, it's not real. You're not well, and you need help. Her eyes widened with hurt, then darkened with anger. Don't you dare speak to me like that. After everything I've done for you, you think you can just walk away from me? I didn't ask for any of this, Chijioke snapped. I didn't ask to be adopted or lied to, and I certainly didn't ask for you to treat me like this. Her face twisted with a mix of desperation and fury. You don't mean that, she whispered. I know you feel it too. The connection we have. You're just afraid to admit it. Chijioke shook his head in disbelief. You're delusional. Adobi stepped closer, her tone turning pleading. Come with me to my room. Let me show you how much I love you. I can make you happy, Chijioke. We don't need anyone else. It's always been just the two of us. No! He shouted, backing away. But she followed him, her determination unrelenting. Before he knew it, she had cornered him in her bedroom. The room, once a place he associated with warmth and safety, now felt suffocating. Adobi reached out, trying to touch his face, but Chijioke slapped her hand away. Don't touch me! He yelled. Stop fighting me, she cried, her voice frantic. You're mine, Chijioke. You'll always be mine. Overwhelmed by rage and betrayal, Chijioke shoved her away, harder than he intended. Adobi stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She fell, her head striking the corner of the wooden table with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Adobi? Chijioke whispered, his chest heaving. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulders, but her body was still, her eyes vacant. Blood pooled beneath her head, staining the carpet. Panic seized him. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. What had he done? With trembling hands, Chijioke grabbed his phone and dialed the police. When the operator answered, his voice was barely audible. I need help. There's been an accident. She's dead. As he hung up, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on him. Chijioke sank to the floor, his head in his hands as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Chioke sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. His mind raced as the officer across from him leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching him like a hawk. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the weight of the night's events bore down on him. I've already told you what happened, Chijioke said, his voice strained but steady. Then tell me again, the officer demanded, his tone skeptical. Because none of this adds up. Why would a boy like you kill a woman like her, a mother who gave you everything? She wasn't my mother, Chijioke snapped, his frustration boiling over. She adopted me. She lied to me about everything about who I am, about my father. She manipulated me, controlled me, and then she... He stopped, his throat tightening. How could he even begin to explain the horrors of what Adobi had done, the lines she had crossed? And then what? the officer pressed, leaning forward. She what? Chijioke's jaw clenched as he tried to maintain his composure. She started acting inappropriately. She didn't see me as her son anymore. She said she loved me, but not like a mother should. He paused, taking a shaky breath. She tried to force herself on me. The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disdain. That's quite the story. You expect us to believe that Adaobi Nwokolo, one of the most respected women in this community, a philanthropist who's dedicated her life to helping others, did that? I'm telling you the truth, Chijioke shot back, his voice cracking. She wasn't who you all thought she was. She was obsessed. She couldn't handle the fact that I didn't see her the same way she saw me. The officer shook his head. Do you hear yourself? Do you know how insane this sounds? This woman took you in, gave you a life most boys your age could only dream of, and this is how you repay her? Chijioke's chest tightened. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was just trying to get away from her. She fell. The officer cut him off with a sharp laugh. She fell? You mean you pushed her? I didn't push her on purpose, Chijioke protested. I was scared. She wouldn't leave me alone, and I... Save it, the officer said coldly. No one's going to buy this. You killed a woman who loved you like a son. You're nothing but an ungrateful violent. I'm not lying, Chijioke shouted, tears streaming down his face. But the officer didn't budge, his expression hard and unforgiving. To the world, Adobi was a saint, a beloved figure who had given her life to charity and motherhood. And now, Chijioke was just the ungrateful son who had taken her life in cold blood. As the door slammed shut behind the officer, Chijioke was left alone in the room, consumed by a mix of anger, fear, and despair. To be continued. Watch out for part 2. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated.